Thank you for the warm welcome. Aloha. So I took the scenic route coming here. Got to see a little bit more of your beautiful state than I expected. But I was told when I said, okay, I'm going to take a little longer than planned. Yeah, no worry. Because you guys got a lot going on, and there's a lot to talk about. I want to start with hope. You know, I was, everywhere I go, there are a lot of challenges to discuss. You start the day looking at the news and figuring out what's going on in the world. What are the things that we need to tackle? What are the things that we need to highlight? And instead of immediately launching into the great challenges and problems that we face, I want to start with hope. Because so often when we speak about the challenges that exist, the question that I am most often asked is, what do we do? Is there hope? Because the darkness seems to surround us on all sides. The forces of evil, the forces of greed and power-hungry politicians seem to be so all-pervading and powerful. What do we do? If I'm just one person, if we are just this small group of people gathered here today, what do we do? Where do we find hope? Our hope is in remembering always and having faith in God's unconditional eternal love for every one of us. So when I'm asked by people, and this is throughout my time in Congress, we say, gosh, Tulsi, how are you so optimistic? How are you not just walking around with a dark cloud over your head all the time? That's why. It doesn't take away from the seriousness of the challenges that we face. It doesn't take away from the very real consequences of the decisions that are being made in Washington that are impacting us as individuals, that are impacting our families, that are impacting our communities, that are impacting our ability to live as a free person in a free nation. All of these issues are very real. But keeping centered in and focused on that eternal truth, that with God's eternal love springs eternal hope, and that with God's eternal love springs courage, springs the strength that every one of us needs to take on these all-important battles. When we are resting in God's love, we know there is no fear. And when we look to why it is that the power elite in Washington, the Democrat elite in Washington, you look at what some of these people are doing to try to take our freedoms away, to try to exert their control over our society, where is that coming from? It's coming from a very deep-seated place of fear in their hearts of losing power. People say, well, why are they doing this? Why are they, we go back to the COVID crackdowns. Why are they trying to keep us locked up in our houses? Why are they trying to force us to do this? Why are they trying to take parents' rights away from having the ability to decide what kind of education your kids get? Why are they cracking down on free speech? Why are they creating this ministry of truth, this government disinformation board? You can go down this laundry list of actions that are being taken, and every one of them goes back to it's coming from a place of fear. And something that our founders recognized exists and would be challenging to a fragile democracy. That the greatest enemy to power and those who seek to abuse their power is liberty. A free people who can think for ourselves, who can gather information for ourselves, make our own decisions, make our own opinions and views about what's happening in our country or around a specific issue. While they have money and they have influence, they have the propaganda media, they have big tech, they've got all of these very powerful tools at their fingertips. It's still not enough. It's not enough. Because whether they're willing to admit it or not, deep down in their hearts, they remember those words that are in our founding documents, we the people. And they know that if we choose to use the power that's in our hands through our voices and through our votes, through our actions, through our pocketbooks, we are far more powerful than them. If we choose to use it. And that's really what it comes down to is how do we dig ourselves out of the mess that we are currently facing today? You know, in those founding documents, we are reminded that a just government only exists with the consent of the governed. And so, while there's every piece of responsibility that we should place on these politicians for the decisions that they are making, we also have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, well, what am I doing? What role do I have to play in getting us out of this? To have a government of, by, and for the people, we have to do our part to ensure that actually happens. And so it begins with that accountability. It begins with being informed before we go and cast our votes. There is so much opportunity to completely transform our government against all of the powerful odds that are stacked against us if we choose to mobilize, which is why I'm so excited about the work that PERK is doing here, because you're taking that grassroots power and that grassroots energy that exists within every single one of us and sending a very strong message to those in leadership here in California about where you stand and who you stand with. I think the example, the most present and current example that we're seeing with the Biden-Harris administration's completely undermining and destroying Title IX is one of those opportunities. In this highly divided and polarized political environment, to say that it's partisan is almost putting it too lightly. It's gone beyond partisanship. It is an us versus them mentality, but what I see is the us is those who are the most powerful elite, and the them is the people. And so when we look at things like President Biden's destruction of Title IX in the name of fairness for women and girls, has done the thing that is most offensive, that is the most egregious expression of hatred and hostility toward women and girls, in completely destroying Title IX by saying any person can now benefit from Title IX, taking away those opportunities from our girls and young women, completely changing potentially the trajectory of their lives. He knew he couldn't get it done by going through Congress. So he went through the back door, as they very often do, and went through this rules and administrative change. We, the people, had no say. Our representatives in Congress had no say. Who do we hold accountable for that? When we can't go to our representative in Congress and say, how come you voted this way, or how come you voted against that? They had no say or input into it. The executive branch, President Biden, took this administrative action. And not only did he take that action, it came with a pretty big stick, so that any school that does not comply with his directive and command and fiat would be punished by removal of federal funding. And this is the thing that gets me, is especially when you look at how my former party often claims to be the party of compassion and care for those who are suffering, for those who don't have much, for families who are living in poverty, for minorities, for people who face greater challenges in their lives. They proclaim to be the party of care and compassion and love. But when you look at their actions, you see the exact opposite. that President Biden proclaims to care so much about women and girls that he's going to take away their opportunities through Title IX. And that if any school that's funded by federal funds does not comply with that, then they will take away those federal funds, and especially and specifically named those public schools where kids are eligible, because they come from poor families, for free and reduced lunch. They're going to take away that federal funding for free and reduced lunch for those kids who are showing up at school hungry and can't afford to buy their breakfast or lunch. It's hard to actually understand how any person with a heart could think that this is a good thing, that this is a positive thing. I've given up on trying to apply logic and, rational thinking to so many of these decisions. The only rational explanation really is what I talked about, that this is about power. We see some of the protests that are happening, another example that are happening in college campuses across the country. The protests that proclaim to be for Palestine, but really are for Hamas terrorists and this radical Islamist ideology. I'm a staunch defender of free speech, even if that speech is not something I agree with. But to have people in our government and in our law enforcement refuse to apply and uphold basic law and order and keeping the peace, specifically with this one group of people, why is that? It's because of fear. It's because of fear of being labeled an Islamophobe or as someone who hates Muslim people, or being called all of these different things that Jewish kids and faculty on these campuses are told, you are not allowed in. You are not allowed in. It all goes back to fear, and it's a dangerous thing when we have people in positions of power who are motivated by fear, because they are willing to do whatever they need to do in order to hold on to that thing that they are afraid of losing, and that thing is power. It's what defines them. They're afraid of becoming irrelevant, that nobody will pay attention to them if they lose that power. What we're facing right now here in the most fundamental way, and I want to make sure we have time for some questions and answers here. I won't go into the long list of issues that we've seen in the egregious offenses against freedom, the egregious offenses against democracy, the egregious offenses against our ability to live in a peaceful and prosperous society, because they're sending our taxpayer dollars to go and fund proxy wars in other parts of the world that actually make us less safe here at home. The future of the country that we love is at stake this year, this election, right now. Nothing less than that, nothing short of that. You often hear politicians say over and over again during election years, well, this is the most important election of our time. I was at an event last week, I think, and I met a former governor of Mississippi, and I was having a similar conversation like this with him and saying that, I told him, this is the first time I have ever truly felt that. And I have said that out loud. And he joked and he said, Tulsi, I used to say that all the time because I was on the ballot. So of course it was the most important election. This is the most important election of my generation, at least. If those in power are allowed to stay in power, we will see everything that we've experienced over these last 3+ years, almost 4 years, ramped up. Because it will go back and run around the country and say, hey, look, you, the American people, just told us by re-electing us, you've given us a mandate to continue exactly what they've been doing. This is not, you'll read in the book why I left the Democratic Party. And you'll read in that book the experiences that I've had that led me to make that decision. But throughout my life, I've always been an independent-minded person. I've been motivated by a desire to serve our country, and have and will always put my country first. What's at stake here is not about, I'm not here to tell you, well, you've got to vote for this party over that party. My message to you and my message to every American across this country is, if you love this country and you cherish peace and you cherish freedom and you want your children to grow up in a country that we are proud of, that is that shining light of freedom and liberty, not only for people in the world, but for us right here at home. Now is the time for us to come together. We will disagree on issues. We will have the opportunity to have dialogue and debate around, okay, well, we've got a certain problem around education or healthcare, or how do we tackle homelessness, or, you know, the mental health challenges we face, or substance abuse. The list of challenges is long and great, and we will have different ideas on how to solve these problems. Unless we live in a free society, we will not be able to discuss the best way to solve these problems. The fact that during COVID, whether on social media in particular, was happening to so many people, saying things that were very obviously true were cause for banning and censorship. And you were accused of spreading disinformation. And it's happened with other issues, and it related to foreign policy and domestic policy. And you talk to people in Washington and say the biggest threat that we face is disinformation, misinformation, hate speech. Well, who gets to decide what that is? I talked to a Coast Guardsman last night. I'm losing track of where I am and what state I'm in and what day of the week it is. It was last night. Thanks. I am in California. I was in Texas last night. No, Florida. Sorry. See? Felt like Texas. And he said that they just got a rule, and I haven't checked this yet or seen documentation, but they were just briefed that in the Coast Guard that there is now a zero tolerance policy for harassment. And that the definition is so vague as to say, if I say something that offends you, then you could accuse me of harassing you. His point was, you know, how many veterans or people in the military we have here tonight? A lot. Thank you. So you know very well, as you do with your family or your actual brothers and sisters or your military family or veteran family, you know, you give each other a hard time. There's some tough talk that goes around every now and then. You give each other some crap. That's just the way it is. His point was, we were talking about recruiting and retention in the military and all these challenges they have. Well, now, okay, yes, of course people should be treated with respect. But you also have to be able to have a little bit of fun and not be worried about every single word that comes out of your mouth. Who gets to decide what speech is acceptable or not? Who gets to decide who has a right to free speech or not? This would have been some kind of theoretical conversation. Maybe I would have imagined that you could argue in a college classroom, maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but this is our reality right now. And we know the answer to that question because it is the administration who believes they alone should have the right to tell us who is allowed to speak freely and who is not. Who gets to decide what disinformation is and who is not. And the thing they say is disinformation on Monday might change to something completely different on Friday. I was at a meeting with different people from different parts of the government and different companies, as well as X, the platform X hosted the conversation. And the question came up about, well, how is X going to police hate speech on its platform? And the response I thought was actually very good. The response was that it is not the responsibility of corporations and businesses to try to tell people how to speak or how to act. That is a collective responsibility for us as we live our lives in how we choose to speak and how we choose to act. What kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to be the person that's always spewing things that are ugly or dark or hateful, or do we want to be the person that's speaking the truth and spreading a positive message that is focused on solutions and how we can grow collectively together? And that is our challenge and our task before us, every one of us as Americans, is not just to go blindly in one direction or another because that's where the pack is going, but to say, even as we may disagree on certain issues or on certain solutions to problems, now is the time for us to come together as Americans, proud Americans, who love our country deeply and stand firmly together on the foundation of freedom. Freedom is on the line. Our founding fathers disagreed fiercely on different issues. They had public debates that sometimes went very, very far, but ultimately they came together around the most important things and chose those words very carefully that they put in our founding documents. They showed us through their example of how to be an American. This is what we must do now for each other, for the sake of our country, and for our ability to continue to live free in this country. Thank you very much.